Now modern-day Myanmar, this was the scene of one of the most unforgiving battlegrounds of the Second World War, holding dominion over one of the greatest military lessons the Allied forces were ever taught. Your surroundings are as much a danger to you as the weapons of your enemy. The harsh, humid and disease-ridden jungles of Southeast Asia not only provided an almost insurmountable battleground, but for a year it was also home to my great-grandfather, Corporal Norman Hunt of the Royal Army Medical Corps. Born and raised in rural Berkshire and then drafted in to serve in the Burma Conflict at the age of 34, the cruel fate of war forced him to embark on a journey most younger men would have despaired to take. Battling nature, the disease, and the ever-looming possibility of being caught by the infamous Japanese army, his incredible story of sheer bravery, resolve, and resilience lives on through my family in the vivid snippets of history he left behind, as well as through the memories of his nearest and dearest that I am speaking to today. Now, with this year marking the 70th anniversary of the end of the largest conflict our world has yet to see, the story that has passed through 3 generations of my family needs to be celebrated now, more than ever. First, we speak to my grandmother and Norman's daughter, Norma Gale. Being only 2 years of age when her father was dispatched and 8 when he returned, she recounts his year-long journey from a jungle camp along the Burma Road in 1942 to his discovery at Kunming, China in March 1943.
Now these are my father's effects from when he was in the medical corps, and unfortunately he got lost when they were ambushed by the Japs, when they were picking up people from a hospital before they were overrun. They were retreating from the Japanese advancing, so he knew he shouldn't go that way that they'd just come back from, because they were trying to get some injured people out of the hospitals before the Japs came.
Right.
Because they weren't, you can imagine what would happen to them.
Of course, yeah.
And so they managed to have some in an ambulance, and they were going to blow up a bridge to stop the Japanese advancing, but it hadn't happened.
Right.
And
okay.
so they were in this little, I don't know what it was, a hut or something, having a rest. They had the ambulance there, and they were strafed by the Japs. They must have come over the bridge quicker than they thought, and they were ambushed. It was at the side of a jungle, so the road went through.
So, anyway.
When he got back out, he found that some were dead, and he thinks it's because he was so fit from all the work he did, and he was, you know, a countryman.
Yeah.
And so he'd run for it and jumped over this huge side fence. And we have here, when he was lost, and he thought he wouldn't make it back, he had, these are the ones that he wrote on the back.
Oh, well, the postcards
with his ink pen that he had in his top pocket.
Oh, wow.
And when they were ambushed and he got into the jungle to get away from the bullets, when he came back, there was no one left.
Either all dead or
They
captured
either dead or gone. He didn't know. So he drank water from the middle of the stream because of his medical training. For them, he knew you don't drink from cider streams. You drank from the middle. He ate certain berries. I mean, they did have some survival. Yes.
There's a part in one of these that said that he just foraged and ate wild tomatoes
anything,
just in the jungle,
anything.
just anything that he could get his hands on.
He encountered an elephant, and he encountered, all these sorts. But he came to a village.
Yeah.
But by then he had malaria. And, I mean, they were so kind. They took him in, they looked after him, they gave him the raw quinine bark to bring down his fever because he was delirious with malaria. But they did the joss sticks over him. And when the Japs were coming through the villages, because they realised it was dangerous for him to stay there, so when he was better, they moved him on to the next one, and then the next one, but they hid him as well.
Oh, God.
Because they knew the Japs were sweeping through. So they really and truly put their lives on the line. And they wrote this for him when he left so that he would have safe passage through other villages, and asking, what it says in theory is, please give him help.
Oh, wow.
and help him.
Because he's a noble man,
yes,
wasn't he?
Yes, a noble man, but we haven't been able to translate it.
Because it's written in
old,
like a rural
Chinese, and that was what it was wrapped up in.
It's in this sort of very delicate rice paper, isn't it?
It's all rice paper.
Wow, it's unbelievable.
So they were very interested when he eventually got to some army headquarters, where he'd been and what he'd done.
Of course, yeah.
And wanted to know what was going on with the Jap movement. But they wouldn't let him home. I think his experience had caused a lot of damage nervous-wise. He obviously had lived on his nerves for so long.
After living with yourself for so long.
He couldn't sleep in a bed for a while. He slept on the floor, and he also had his cookery knife with him. So people learnt not to touch him.
Otherwise he would.
No, it was...
From being in the jungle, he's on edge.
He was on edge, constantly on edge. He was very defensive. And also, of course, food-wise, it was very difficult for him to adapt to proper food.
Claire Chandler is Norman's granddaughter. The fond memories of a warm and devoted grandfather led to her fascination with his story as she grew older, leading to her undertaking the task of transcribing his diary of events written on the back of the postcards that we saw earlier.
He was really patient, never rushed, always had time. And I can remember sort of sitting on his knee, and he'd get out a book, an old fairy story book. When we'd see him quite often, he'd read fairy stories to me. He used to sit in his chair, quite emotional actually, thinking back, either side of the fireplace, and had 2 chairs. And he'd sit there, and after his lunch I would go and sit on his lap, and we'd read their stories, and very special.
Yeah.
As I got older, I learnt more about him, because he was just my granddad. As I got older, Mum, Norma, told me more about his life, and then I just couldn't believe that somebody could go through that experience and survive and be the granddad, be the man who I sat on his knee. He survived all that, which is quite incredible. And yet he never really talked about his experience, not a lot. It would come out in snippets. But some of the things, Japs had search party in jungle, was thankful when it became dark, crossed river up to my neck in water, found road too dangerous, so had to keep to jungle. 3 days without food except for wild tomatoes I found. Didn't feel hungry but very thirsty. Things like that is absolutely amazing. And then how he befriended, and people took him in. They must have really regarded him and thought he was a special man as well. There was something about him that they connected with, because they took a huge risk in protecting him.
My grandfather and son-in-law to Norman, Brian Gale, had a military bonding that led to a lot of his stories coming out through conversations they had together. As such, he had a huge admiration for not only the story of his journey, but for the man that became a part of his family afterwards.
Having served in the army as a national serviceman, of course, I had a certain amount of bonding through the army, really. Yeah. So we discussed very often the sort of different aspects and what was going on, and how we did things and how they did things in those days, and comparing like with like. And of course, in this discussion, we sort of talked about the past, which we always tend to do, and I used to talk about what did he do in the war, like one does. What did you do? When of course he used to describe very, very vividly sometimes how he managed to break out of the compound where he was and escape into the jungle, which was quite dramatic, really, when you think about it. I don't know whether we would have had the nerve of the bottle to have done it, but there was no way back really for him. He got out,
This is a story that has been passed down from my family for the past 3 generations. And it's only now, after being truly engrossed in the story, as my mother was and my grandmother is that I truly learned to appreciate the human side of the truly great stories of the war. From my great-grandfather emerging from the jungle finally in Kunming in 1943, to the fact that he was awarded a commendation by Field Marshal A.P. Wavell. you do realise that these are stories that could definitely end up in a building like this behind me, being told to people around the world. But they are special to my family. Being passed down through 3 generations, it's no surprise it is. And the stories that you have, and the stories that your family has, will always be special to you.
It's a lovely day. Tomorrow is a lovely day. Come and feast your tear-dimmed eyes on tomorrow's clear